Previously, we examined the structural dynamics between parents-in-law, husband and daughter-in-law. We analyzed where responsibility was displaced, where boundaries were crossed, and how relational tension became systemically reinforced. But structural analysis alone is not sufficient. Understanding how a relationship collapses does not fully explain why it manifests so intensely in certain individuals, nor why it takes such extreme forms, such as complete relational severance. So today, we move deeper. We must ask a more uncomfortable question. Where did this rupture truly begin? Did it begin after marriage, or did it begin much earlier, quietly accumulating in a part of life that was never fully processed, never fully integrated? Philosophy at its best does not begin by asking whether an action is right or wrong. It begins by asking, at the end of what process does this action stand? The Tibetan Book of the Dead offers a profound framework for this inquiry. It teaches that human beings do not pass through the bardo, the intermediate state, only after death. We pass through many bardos while still alive. A bardo is a transitional state. The old world has dissolved, but the new one has not yet taken form. It is a psychological threshold, an in-between space where identity destabilizes. From this perspective, what appears today as extreme relational, cutoff, particularly total estrangement from in-laws, may not be a sudden personality defect. It may be the resurfacing of an unfinished transition. In other words, an unpassed bardo. When a relationship collapses, our first instinct is moral judgment. That's disrespectful. That's selfish. That's abnormal. But philosophy interrupts us. Is this truly the person's essence, or is it the residue of a transition they never completed? This lecture is not about excusing destructive behavior, nor is it about condemning it. It is about shifting the language from morality to process. Because if we misdiagnose a structural phenomenon as a purely ethical failure, we will repeat the harm. Adolescence is one of the most significant psychological bardos in human development. It is not merely a stage of growth. It is an ontological transition. During adolescence, a child no longer fully accepts parental explanations, yet they have not completed the construction of their own worldview. They are suspended between structures. Now consider what happens when parental divorce occurs during this stage. This is not merely a family event. It can function as a structural collapse of foundational assumption. Three core propositions often destabilize. 1. The world is predictable. 2. Adults resolve problems. Close relationships protect me. When these implicit axioms fracture, the adolescent does not merely feel sadness. They experience existential instability. And here lies the critical distinction. Not all adolescents who experience divorce collapse. Some recalibrate, others disintegrate internally. The difference is not the event itself. The difference is whether the transition is processed or abandoned. The Tibetan text warns if, in the bardo, one clings to fearful apparitions, they solidify into karma. Psychologically translated, unprocessed fear does not disappear. It reorganizes and returns. Let us examine three structural conditions that determine whether an adolescent bardo becomes integrated or frozen. 1. Worldview collapse versus worldview adjustment. All children experience shock when divorce occurs, but shock becomes trauma when meaning is withheld. If the adolescent is excluded from explanation, if events unfold abruptly and without interpretive support, they may reach a silent conclusion. The world does not explain itself, therefore it cannot be trusted. Once that belief crystallizes, later, relational conflicts will not trigger curiosity. They will trigger preemptive withdrawal. Cutoff becomes protection. 2. Loss of emotional availability. The critical variable is not physical presence. It is emotional availability. Parents may remain physically accessible, yet psychologically consumed by their own grief, anger, or litigation. In such cases, the adolescent becomes emotionally parentless. Conversely, even in divorce, if at least one adult parent, mentor, grandparent remains emotionally available, the bardo can be traversed. The transition becomes survivable. Attachment theory consistently confirms this. A single stable attachment figure dramatically reduces long-term relational dysregulation. 3. Distortion of relational trust models. Adolescents learn the operating principles of intimacy by observing their parents. When divorce unfolds through sudden, unexplained rupture, forced loyalty toward one parent, chronic conflict, or explosive resolution, the adolescent internalizes a relational algorithm. Long-term intimacy becomes dangerous. Later, in adulthood, relationships that resemble authority, hierarchy, or family structure may unconsciously activate this algorithm. And here's where in-law relationships become psychologically significant. Parents-in-law are not merely additional adults. They symbolically represent authority, family system, generational structure, another parental dynamic. For someone with an unfinished adolescent bardo, this relational stage becomes a reenactment arena. The past is not remembered, it is relived. Cutoff, then, is not random hostility. It is defensive repetition. Now we must address an uncomfortable observation. Why do some individuals endure identical circumstances, yet remain relationally stable? The answer lies in 4 structural axes. 1. Cognitive development. The ability to conceptualize complexity rather than split into binaries. 2. Attachment structure, secure versus anxious or avoidant internal working models. 3. Meaning-making capacity, whether suffering becomes narrative, integration, or frozen chaos. 4. Environmental buffers, the presence of stable adults, mentors, or institutions. The divergence is not moral superiority. It is structural resilience. At this point, we must guard against 2 extreme reactions. The first is moral absolutism. Just endure it. Family is family. The second is permissive relativism. They're traumatized, so nothing can be expected. This lecture rejects both. Understanding is not absolution, and endurance is not infinite. A mature philosophical posture requires holding 2 truths simultaneously. Behavior has causes. Behavior has consequences. To collapse either truth is to abandon responsibility. Our task, therefore, is not to assign villain and victim roles. It is to examine whether the current relational rupture is the surface expression of an earlier unfinished transition. If so, then moral pressure alone will intensify the fracture. Commands such as, be mature, you're overreacting, respect your elders, may function not as correction, but as reactivation of the original instability. In developmental terms, this is not primarily an ethical failure. It is a failure of recognition. Over the remainder of this series, we will explore how adolescent psychological bardos solidify into adult relational strategies, why some individuals move toward integration, why others remain in emotional freeze, why some choose relational amputation as a form of survival. We will approach this through developmental psychology, attachment theory, and classical philosophy. This is not a lecture designed to attack anyone, nor is it designed to blur reality with comforting ambiguity. It is an invitation to confront unfinished transitions, to distinguish explanation from excuse, and to restore boundaries without abandoning understanding. If this topic feels uncomfortable, it may be because it touches something structurally unresolved. My hope is that for some, this becomes the beginning of self-understanding. For others, perhaps it becomes relief from misplaced guilt, if you believe this structural lens is necessary. In today's conversations about family and estrangement, consider subscribing and sharing. Expanding the language of understanding is often the first step toward transforming relationships. Because before we attempt to change people, we must change the framework through which we interpret them. And that is where philosophy begins. In the previous section, we concluded with a critical shift in perspective. We moved away from the question, why does this person behave so extremely? And replaced it with a more structural one. Where did they stop? If adolescence is a psychological bardo, a transitional state, in which the old world collapses before a new one, stabilizes, then the essential question becomes this: why do some young people pass through that threshold while others remain suspended within it? Because here lies the decisive divergence. The same event, parental divorce, does not produce the same adult. The difference is not moral character. It is not strength of will. It is not goodness versus selfishness. It is the pathway through which the event was interpreted. Let us now enter the core of the question. Why do some children not collapse? Even within identical environments, not all adolescents fall into existential destabilization. Developmental psychology identifies several protective mechanisms that prevent the psychological bardo from becoming frozen. 1. The capacity for meaning-making. The first protective factor is meaning-making. Children who do not internalize divorce as personal failure or cosmic collapse typically had access to language. Not innate optimism, but interpretive support. An adult helped them translate the event. They were told, repeatedly and clearly, this is not your fault. This is a limitation between adults. This does not define your worth. When suffering is narrated, it becomes integrated. When suffering is silent, it becomes identity. Meaning-making produces what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to step back and observe one's experience rather than drown in it. This capacity later becomes a cornerstone of relational resilience. 2. The minimum unit of secure attachment. Attachment does not require perfection. It requires consistency. Even one emotionally available adult parent, mentor, teacher, grandparent can provide a psychological anchor. Secure attachment functions as a reference point. It tells the nervous system, not everything is collapsing. Without that anchor, adolescence becomes not a transition, but free fall. 3. Environmental buffers. Schools, peer groups, religious communities, coaches, these institutions distribute emotional shock. They provide experiential evidence that not all systems disintegrate simultaneously. A child who witnesses stability elsewhere learns an essential counter-belief. Some relationships endure. That belief becomes a shield against total relational distrust. 4. Temperament and neural reactivity. Temperament matters, but not in the way people assume. Genetics influence sensitivity to stress, speed of emotional arousal, and recovery time. They do not dictate relational destiny. Temperament is an amplifier, not an author. Environment and interpretation modulate biological predisposition. Thus, parental divorce does not automatically produce psychological collapse. What fractures identity is not the event itself, but isolation within it. Silence is more destabilizing than separation. The bardo is not meant to be avoided. It is meant to be crossed. When crossed, it deepens insight. When frozen, it repeats. And this brings us to the 3 developmental pathways that frequently emerge in adulthood. 3 relational pathways in adulthood. Modern developmental psychology suggests that adults who experience parental divorce during adolescence tend to follow one of 3 broad relational trajectories. These are not diagnoses. They are adaptive strategies. 1. The meaning-making path. This is the most integrated pathway. Individuals on this trajectory interpret their parents' divorce as a human limitation, not a universal betrayal. They think, my parents failed each other, not me. Marriage is difficult, but not inherently false. In adulthood, conflict does not equal catastrophe. When disagreements arise with a spouse, they pause rather than amputate. When tension emerges with in-laws, they interpret difference as difference, not threat. They set boundaries. They negotiate. They seek mediation if necessary. They do not idealize relationships, but they do not perceive them as inherently dangerous. Conflict becomes a problem to manage, not a signal to escape. 2. The freeze path. This is the most common and the most misunderstood. These individuals were not necessarily exposed to extreme trauma. Rather, they were deprived of explanation. The divorce occurred, but no one translated its meaning. Emotion became suspended. Outwardly, they may function well. They succeed academically, socially, professionally. But when intimacy deepens, especially within family structures, the nervous system activates. In-laws may trigger disproportionate anxiety. Small requests may feel heavy. Disagreement may produce internal shutdown. They do not sever relationships, but they withdraw incrementally. They reduce contact. They postpone visits. They avoid confrontation. The relationship remains, but it exists under chronic tension. This is not indifference. It is unresolved processing. The bardo was neither crossed nor cut. It was paused. 3. The cutoff path. This is the most socially criticized pathway. Here, the adolescent internalized a core belief. Closeness leads to collapse. For them, divorce was not merely a separation. It was proof that intimacy is structurally unsafe. If every conflict they observed ended in rupture, their nervous system learned a formula. Conflict equals destruction. Therefore, the most efficient survival strategy is preemptive severance. In adulthood, this may manifest as immediate blocking of contact, refusal of visits, sudden total estrangement, relational amputation without prolonged negotiation. From the outside, this appears cold, hostile, even immoral. From the inside, it is defensive coherence. It is not psychosis. Reality testing remains intact. There are no delusions or hallucinations. Social functioning often continues in other domains, nor is it purely genetic. What we observe is an attachment injury-based adaptation, a strategy that once maximized survival continues, operating even when the original threat is no longer present. The nervous system reacts to symbolic resemblance, not objective danger. Thus, an in-law's request may not be evaluated rationally. It may be processed as a historical echo. What this means: extreme relational cutoff is not corrected through moral pressure. It does not dissolve through persuasion. It does not disappear through demands for endurance, because what we are witnessing is not a conscious choice alone. It is the residue of an unfinished transition, a bardo that stalled, and once stalled, it does not dissolve by itself. It waits, and every time intimacy deepens, it reactivates. This is why we must change the question. Not, why are they behaving this way? But where did the process stop? Understanding is not absolution, but intervention without understanding is re-traumatization. Before attempting repair, we must understand why severance once felt safer than negotiation. This lecture is not an endorsement of destructive behavior, nor is it an indictment. It is an attempt to map the structure beneath it, because only by identifying the original fracture can we determine where to hold firm, where to set limits, and where healing is realistically possible. And this brings us to the next stage. How do these survival strategies collide within marriage itself? Why do some couples endure tension and adapt? Why do others freeze into emotional distance? And why do some invoke divorce with alarming speed? In Part 4, we will examine how these three pathways interact inside the most intimate structure of all the marital bond. What we have outlined today is the architecture. Next, we examine how that architecture behaves under pressure.